Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we'll discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we'll try to understand the legal and environmental challenges which are associated with the Great Nicobar project and how it has led to the mass displacement of indigenous tribes in the region. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to assess the rising issue of plastic waste in our country, and in that context, what are the recent changes which has been made by the government of India in the plastic waste management rules of recently issued. Then, from a prelims pointers, we'll try to take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition, keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2026. So, stay tuned. Where the article today highlights the legal and the environmental challenges which are associated with the Great Nicobar project and raises some very important concerns associated with the indigenous forest rights of these tribal communities and the displacement which they are facing thanks to the development of an infrastructure project in the region. The issue which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of environmental conservation and preservation. So if we look at this region of Andaman and Nicobar from the ecological point of view, it forms one of the world's most important biologically biodiverse hotspot region, considering that it not only facilitates for the kind of the sequestration of carbon from the environment, but also facilitates the climate regulation. Considering if we look to the policies which are being implemented in this region, it seems to be majorly driven from the policies from the mainland India, which is far removed from the actual ecological needs of the region. For example, this is something which we term as helicopter approach in your ethics, where the policies to actually address the issues which are being faced at the grassroots level, they are actually being designed and curated by the politicians and the bureaucrats who are sitting in their air-conditioned office. And this is exactly what is taking place with the announcement of the Great Nicobar Island mega infrastructure project, where these people, these indigenous tribes, they are actually protesting against it. So today's article highlights that how the draft plan, which outlines the relocation of these Nicobarese tribal communities, which has been affected by the development of this infrastructure project, it has created confusion and has further exacerbated the existing apprehensions among the tribal people. The tribal people who have been protesting from now 4 years for the clearance of this 92,000 crore project after withdrawing their consent in 2002. And now they are also alleging that how their forest rights under the Forest Right Act 2006 is not being settled by the government of India. So in this context, because the reason is so frequently in the news, let's first try to analyze it from the perspective of the prelims examination. Keep this in mind that Andaman and Nicobar is a very important union territory of India which comprises of 572 islands, of which currently 38 are inhabited by the various indigenous community. This Andaman and Nicobar Islands are separated by a 10-degree channel or a 10-degree latitude over and above the equator. The capital and the largest city of this union territory is the Port Blair, whose official name has now been changed to Sri Vijayapuram. Keep this in mind that it was here at the Port Blair where the Britishers created the cellular jail or the infamous Kala Pani Jail, where even your Veer Savarkar was actually arrested and imprisoned under the Nasik conspiracy case. The Great Nicobar Islands, which you guys can see here on the map, actually forms the southernmost tip of India, which is named as Indira Point. So when we have understood about the geographical location of Andaman and Nicobar, 10-degree channel and the Indira Point, let's try to understand the geography and the ecological importance of the region. So, the Great Nicobar Archipelago consists of 19 islands and basically inhabits a population of more than 8,000 people. We are considering that it actually falls in the tropical region. It actually facilitates a very dense, natural and evergreen forest vegetation. The vegetation which comprises of evergreen rainforest, mangroves and pandan forest. Pandan forest basically consists of trees like, for example, scrub pine trees. scrub pine trees, which basically grows on the coast of Great Nicobar in the littoral region and actually act as a kind of a very important source of staple diet for the Shompen tribes. So this region of Great Nicobar is actually inhabited by two important tribes. One is your Nicobaris and one is your Shompen. Keep this in mind that both forms part of the 75 particularly vulnerable tribal groups which we have in our country. The 75 PVTGs, which are actually listed by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs on certain criteria. So, for example, these tribes might be having low literacy or poor economic background or the kind of agriculture activity which they are following or the technologies or which they are following. Let's say, for example, living a kind of a hunter-gatherer kind of a lifestyle. So, that basically predates to the pre-agriculture level of technology. Thus, they are majorly reliant on the primary sector or the cultivation of some indigenous crops like for example coconuts, areca nuts, banana, mango, etc. 85% of this region of Great Nicobar has been listed as a biosphere reserve, considering that it hosts some very important and endemic species. Like for example, it forms part of a very important nesting site for the largest marine turtle species in the world, that is giant leatherback turtle, which has also been listed as vulnerable on the IUCN category. Or for example, two very important endangered species on IUCN, which is your Great Nicobar megapode or crab-eating macaque, as well as the Nicobar tree shrew, some very important endemic species which are found in the region of Great Nicobar. It also acts as a very major site for the carbon sequestration because in this region we have some very important pristine forest dating back to millions of years, consisting of mangroves, coral reefs and seagrass beds. Very recently, your coral reefs has been repeatedly in the news. Also, more importantly because of the first coral reef cryobank is being developed by the country of Philippines. A very important fact for your prelims. And these coral reefs are also called as Amazon rainforest, right, of the sea region. Why? Because it actually, kind of facilitates such large scale dense green vegetation, right, act as a kind of a feeding source for them, right, in the aquatic area. And thus, they also provide a very important site for the carbon sequestration as well. Thus, overall, don't you think that, let's say, for example, if our government has very recently initiated the new nationally determined contribution targets for ourselves to be achieved by the year of 2035, this region of Great Nicobar is going to play a very pivotal role in that because it acts as a kind of a major carbon sink and also maintain the ecological balance. So once we have understood the ecological importance of this region, now let's try to understand that what is this development project which keeps on repeating in the news, right? Currently, the budget of this project has been increased now to 92,000 crore. It's a mega project for the holistic development of the Great Nicobar Island. So as we understood that in this region, there are living two particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And we saw two important criteria to identify them. One is low literacy level and one is that maybe they are not having that much of economic development if we compare to the development which is taking place across the country. So don't you think that such very important mega project, infrastructure project will actually bring a lot of capital expenditure, a kind of a crowding in effect being done by the government of India, and that will facilitate the kind of holistic development of the people living in the Great Nicobar region. That is the initiative of the government. So the government, this project has been piloted by the Niti Aayog, and thus there has been creation of a special purpose vehicle or an agency whose entire focus actually relies on the development of this project, and that is Andaman and Nicobar Islands Integrated Development Corporation, called as ANITCO. So ANITCO has basically been targeted to develop a transshipment port at Galathia Bay in the region of Great Nicobar, to actually create a dual use international airport for both civil as well as military functions, and to create a 450 megawatt power plant which combines gas based as well as solar energy power generation. And then to actually facilitates a lot of tourists as well as a lot of settlements where a kind of a planned urban infrastructure will be created. There will be creation of a township and a greenfield city. Now, there are certain official data which we can derive from the Press Information Bureau itself, where it says that for the development of this project, as per the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, there will be a diversion of approximately 130 kilometer square area of forest. But the Press Information Bureau also emphasized on another point. It says that how there has been 88 crore rupees of fund which has been earmarked for wildlife conservation in this region, to actually conserve these important species, as well as to create special medical units for the people who are living in this region. Now let's try to understand that beside the local development initiative as well as the creation of infrastructure in this region, which will obviously facilitate various kind of skilling of the people, creation of employment in this region, it will actually kind of significantly increase their livelihood opportunities. Beside these reasons, are there several important economic and strategic reasons involved? And the answer is absolutely yes. For that purpose, just try to look at this particular map. So this is where the project is actually being developed. Just look that if we create a kind of a transshipment port in this region, the vicinity of some very important trade areas which lies within the Great Nicobar, Yangon, Bangkok, Phuket, much closer to the region of Indonesia also. So don't you think this one interpretation can be that creation of such transshipment route in this Indo-Pacific Ocean, sitting very close to a very important bottleneck, that is Strait of Malacca, right? Which actually forms a kind of a very important gateway for our products to trade in the region of Indo-Pacific Ocean. So if we are developing such an important strategic infrastructure project in this region, don't you think it forms an integral component of our Act East policy? And thus, it will actually significantly increase our trace prospect in the region of Southeast Asia. So for example, it can, right, if we are creating such good logistic, right, sea-based communication chain in this region, don't you think it is going to significantly increase the demand for Indian products? That can take place. So that will also help us to actually, kind of achieve our target to become a $30 trillion economy by the year of 2047. Also, it will actually help us to achieve the Ministry of Commerce and Industries target, where we want to become a $2 trillion export economy by the year of 2030 itself. So it is an integral pillar for these trade aspect. More importantly, it actually acts as a kind of a very important counter which we are doing to the string of pearls policy of China, where China is actually trying to encircle our country's trade and security routes in the region of Indian Ocean by creating some very important strategic, military as well as economic ports. Like for example, taking the lease of 99 years for Hambantanta port in Sri Lanka, or for example, creating a very important military base in the region of Djibouti. So to counter this string of pearls, our government has basically brought a policy called as diamond necklace, where we have also started creating such important trade ports as well as military ports in the region of Indian Ocean, an extension of which is this Great Nicobar project. Also, let's say for example some disasters take place in one of the countries of Southeast Asia. Don't you think that because of the creation of such port, we can actually dock our humanitarian assistance based ship in this region? And thus, it can actually significantly increase our role as first responder in the region in the terms of any disaster, a tsunami takes place or an earthquake occurs, right? So don't you think that because of the creation of this infrastructure project, it will also increase our prominence in various multilateral grouping in this region, like for example, BMSTEC or for example, SARC. So Act East policy, increasing of our trade to achieve the economic targets which we have set, strategic importance to actually counter the China's string of pearls, as well as to increase our prominence in the multilateral forums. Now this project seems very important. But because of the development of these projects, there are a lot of ecological challenges which will be faced by the tribal people. And that is the major argument by the opposition, So you guys can recall that how in the month of October there was a very prominent article which was written by Sonia Gandhi, a very prominent member of the opposition, where she argued that how this project poses an existential danger to the island's indigenous tribal communities. The first issue which is being raised by these tribal groups, right, Nicobaris and Shompen, is that it will actually lead to the influx of outsiders in the region who will start utilizing and exploiting their resources, and ultimately the arrival of these tourists will eventually lead these regions to the same level of ecological degradation which is being faced by the hilly states like Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh today. This is exactly something which we called as Deku's syndrome. What is this Deku syndrome? So if you guys can recall from your modern history lectures, you guys can recall about Santhal Hul of 1855, which was led by Sidhu and Kanhu Murmu brothers. Or for example, you guys can recall about Munda Ulugulan, which took place in 1899, led by Birsa Munda. Even earlier, these tribals, they were basically protesting against what? The influx of outsiders who basically kind of violate their indigenous right on the soil, right? Because they term themselves as son of soil, by the various policies which they consider to be exploitative in the nature. And that is the same apprehension which is being kind of raised now by this Nicobaris and Shompen tribe. Another major argument is that it will actually lead to a significant disruption of ecology, where the cutting of trees in this 130 km square areas will actually lead or is actually amounts to estimated 15% of the island's land, leading to the cutting of more than 8.5 lakh trees. Take it? Don't you think that act as a kind of an antithetical to the newly nationally determined contribution which we have set for ourselves? So at one point of time, we are making a kind of a global claim that we are going to create 3.5 to 4 billion ton of additional carbon sequestration, right? And for that purpose, we will do what? More afforestation. And at the same point of time, we are launching a kind of such mega infrastructure project where the large scale cutting of trees will take place, large scale deforestation will take place. The government is saying do not worry about it. We have got a new provision where we can balance this cutting of trees. How? By bringing accredited compensatory afforestation provision in the Forest Conservation Act of 2023. What is this afforestation provision? Let's try to understand this. So the government is saying that, see, here we are cutting 130 km square area in the region of Great Nicobar, where let's say we are going to cut 8.5 lakh trees approximately, but we are going to buy an equal amount of land, not the government, UNITCO. UNITCO will be either allotted or buy or take a lease of equal amount of land in the region of Haryana, and there we will do equal amount of afforestation. So that will act as a kind of a compensation for the deforestation which has taken place. यहाँ तक तो सब ठीक लग रहा है. But there are some problems which was raised by Sonia Gandhi also in the article, where she said that, okay, first and foremost, this area which you are saying has been allotted to UNITCO. Almost 15% of that has already been diverted to mining in Haryana. है ना? कोई sense है इस बात की? Second, she is saying that, ठीक है, first and foremost, when you are cutting the trees in Great Nicobar region, here there are certain endemic trees. Here the vegetation is tropical evergreen. How you will grow these endemic trees growing in the region of tropical evergreen forest in the subtropical deciduous region of Haryana, right? So don't you think that the same amount of endemic trees of the same species cannot grow in the region of Haryana? Doesn't even matter that if you are allowing for compensatory land there or not, right? Second is that these trees, they will actually take years to grow to a certain level and actually allow for the same capacity of carbon sequestration. So you cannot match it with the current level of carbon sequestration which is being provided in the region of Great Nicobar by these trees. Clear? And such deforestation is actually going to threaten one of the world's most unique flora and fauna ecosystem, which is highly susceptible to various kind of natural disasters. For example, when the tsunami of 2004 took place, it led to the subsidence of almost 15 feet of land. Or for example, as recently as in the month of July 2025, this particular region was actually impacted or affected by the earthquake of the magnitude of 6.2 on the Richter scale. Then there are going to be significant impact on the overall ecological nature of the Great Nicobar. So for example, when we look at these trees do not only act as a major source of carbon sequestration, but they also contain some very dense roots. The roots which actually kind of hold the topsoil with the bedrock. But now because these trees has been removed, don't you think that the soil degradation will take place? So the fertile soil which exists, that will be entirely removed. And thus, it will actually lead to the loss of fertile lands also. Then, let's say there is underground water here. So these roots actually kind of extract that underground water through the process of xylem and phylum and takes it to the leaf. From the leaf, evapotranspiration takes place in the tropical region. This transpiration allows the water for the process of condensation, which ultimately kind of facilitates precipitation and rain in the region. Now, don't you think with the absence of these 8.5 lakh trees, a large scale underground water will keep on lying dormant, and that will ultimately disrupt the entire water cycle itself, right? Absence of the trees, increasing carbon emission, no source for carbon sequestration will ultimately impact our Glasgow targets of earlier and newly nationally determined contribution also. It will further significantly harm the marine habitat, the narrow ecological niches, and will have a significant impact on coral reefs and mangroves, which act as a kind of a fish nursery grounds, thus impacting almost 648 species of flora and 330 species of fauna, including some very endemic species like, for example, wild pig, tree shrew, great Nicobar, crested serpent eagle, your paradise flycatcher. It will also act as a threat to the Champagne tribe because the proposed project areas have been important for aging grounds for the hunter-gatherer nomadic community. It will act as a threat to the largest turtle species, giant leatherback turtle, act as a threat to the coral and marine ecosystem as well as the sea dugongs due to the loss of seagrass meadows because of the rising anthropogenic activities. Then these tribal people, are being represented by various kind of NGOs which work in the region. One such very important NGO is Kalp Vriksh. They are raising that how even the kind of the safeguard provisions which exist under the various provisions and the acts of the government, even they are not being applied with the spirit of later. For example, first and foremost is the Land Acquisition and the Rehabilitation Act of 2013. So when our constitution was made, okay, our constitution makers over a period of time, our lawmakers, they realized that a fundamental mistake has been done, where the right to property was actually eventually given, right, in the original constitution as a kind of a fundamental right. But if it is a fundamental right, then if let's say government is saying that we are trying to implement the directive principle of state policy, like for example creating this infrastructure project, and we want to take your land, you are saying nahi, it's my fundamental right, main nahi dunga, right? Thus, the government brought the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978 and shifted the right to property from being a fundamental right to a legal and constitutional right. Thus, the government can now take your land for the development of this project, but yes, provide adequate compensation and rehabilitation under the Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Act of 2013, under which there is a specific provision that there shall be conducting of social impact assessment under the principle of right to fair compensation and transparency. However, the current land which is being given, right, or has been envisaged to give to these Nicobaris and Champagne tribes, it completely omits any reference to this right to fair compensation and transparency principle altogether. Then, let's say for example, these Nicobaris and Champagne tribes, they are actually inhabiting a certain region for more than 75 years or continuously for 3 generations. Then under the Forest Right Act 2006, they have the right to use, kind of minor forest produce, right? They can still use it. Or for example, it shall be provided for enough preservation of their indigenous culture and tradition. But as it empowers the Champagne, the authority to protect, preserve, regulate and manage the forest. However, as per the NGO Kalp Vriksh, The Tribal Council of Great Nicobar's plea to return to their ancestral village has been rejected because the development is taking place now. So even their FRA 2006 is not being recognized. Then as per the coastal regulation zone, the port construction is entirely prohibited in the littoral regions, in the CRZ-1A region due to the presence of various turtle nesting sites, like for example the giant leatherback turtle. But what the officials did, they actually went and did the assessment in the off season of nesting, when those seasons when the turtles are not nesting on the coast. They said, देखिए एकदम खाली पड़ा हुआ है, that's why we are developing. Then comes your transparency and judicial oversight. So the National Green Tribunal has given a very specific directive to create a kind of a high-powered committee to review this green clearance. The government submitted the report to this high-powered committee, but that too in the sealed envelope, citing that no, there is a national security, invoking the section 6 of RTI Act 2005. So these documents were not made public, that what are the arguments which is being given by the government of India. And thus the opposition time and again has been raising this issue that how this development project will actually significantly alter the indigenous rights of the people in the region. Okay? So till here we are actually focusing on the one side of the coin, but let's try to hear from the government's defense also. Government is saying that we have done enough risk assessment and the decision to develop Great Nicobar Island has been taken after due consideration of its ecological, social as well as more importantly the strategic aspect. So the government is saying that from out of this, right, total 92,000 crore rupees, 81 crore rupees is specifically being allotted to create research institutes and departments for wildlife conservation. There is a statutory scrutiny of the project which has been done under the Environment Impact Assessment of 2006. The government has already initiated Champagne policy back in 2015 in consultation with the local NGO, that is Adim Janjati Vikas Samiti. So the Minister of Environment time and again has emphasized that how the project is not going to displace the Nicobaris and the Champagne tribes. Only 84 kilometer square area within the tribal reserve, and it will only impact 1.8% of the total forest area. These 8.5 lakh trees only constitutes less than 2% of the total forest area of the region. Then there will be an effective oversight by the National Council for Scheduled Tribe under Article 338A to generate employment and importance for defense also, right, in the context of China for example. And under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, the union territories with forest land, right? So let's say there is a UT and it has a forest land of more than 75% of total geographical area. They shall not be insisted upon providing non-forest land for raising compensatory afforestation. That is the argument which is being made by the opposition. However, the government has said that yes, indeed, we are taking the cognizance of this provision of Forest Conservation Act of 1980. The forested region in the region of Great Nicobar is much more than 75%. That is also true. But try to understand that we have some very important strategic issues involved as well. And thus they are invoking the issue of national strategic security in the region to kind of override these provisions. So what can be the ideal way forward when such questions are asked? Try to actually shoot the arrow, not from you, but on someone else's shoulder. And in this context, you guys can actually invoke the concept of nature's legal right. Okay? You guys can actually use a quote given by a very important sociologist, Verir Elvin, where he said that the tribal people should be allowed to develop along the lines of their own genius, right, instead of a kind of a foreign intervention. Okay? So we can actually invoke that how the Supreme Court has taken into the cognizance, where the Supreme Court has earlier stalled various such projects on the name of development, but if it is infringing significantly the indigenous rights of tribal people. A great example of that is the Odisha Mining Corporation versus Ministry of Environment. So you guys might have heard about a tribe called as Dongriya Kond tribe, which inhabits the region of Odisha. So in Odisha, there is your Niyamgiri Hills. In Niyamgiri Hills, there was basically a bauxite mining project which was actually being developed. And this Dongriya Kond tribe was actually kind of opposing this bauxite mining project. The Supreme Court took the cognizance of this issue and empowered the Gram Sabha to represent the tribal people and then take the decision by themselves. So when Gram Sabha basically voted against this bauxite mining project, it was entirely stalled by the Supreme Court of India. And this is something which is considered as the right of nature also, right, which has been adopted by various countries, for example, Bolivia, Colombia, New Zealand, etc., right. And this basically, kind of derive its way from a very prominent book called as Should Trees Have a Standing, written by Christopher Stone, where he basically argues that how these trees, these coral reefs, these mangroves, these littoral forests, they also have a life of their own, and that shall be recognized as well. So what are the significant judgments which our Supreme Court has taken, the apex court has taken for the concept of environment conservation? One very famous is Muhammad Salim versus State of Uttarakhand, where the Uttarakhand High Court actually gave the legal personhood to Ganga and Yamuna River as well as Gangotri and Yamunotri glaciers. Supreme Court in MC Mehta versus Union of India specifically stated that industries which are discharging untreated effluents in the river violates the right to life under Article 21 and introduced a very important principle called as polluters pay principle. Then there is your T.N. Godvarman versus Union of India, in which Supreme Court imposed a nationwide ban on non-forest activities in forest without approval under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. So if we follow T.N. Godvarman and then if we read this FCA 1980 and if we apply them together, then yes indeed, a lot of more safeguards shall be provided to these tribes. Very recently, a very important case, M.K. Ranjit Singh versus Union of India, in which Supreme Court held that even the right against the adverse impact of climate change, which these people will face in the absence of trees, leading to more carbon dioxide accumulation and thus more global warming, thus it is also a fundamental right now provided to the people under Article 14, that is right to equality, and Article 21, that is right to life. Use these judgments very importantly in your conclusion when you are writing on the concept of environment conservation. Try to attempt this particular question and we move forward to the next news, where the article throws light on the recent changes which has been made in the plastic waste management rules of 2025, and we'll try to understand that how it leads to the dilution of efforts towards tackling the issue of plastic menace in our country, which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of environment conservation. So let's first try to assess the concerns which are associated with plastic waste. So for example, we also, let's say for example, generate various kind of solid waste, organic matter waste, etc. But why it becomes so detrimental when it comes to the plastic waste generation? So let's first try to understand that what is a plastic. So plastic is basically a kind of a synthetic polymer which is actually derived from the fossil fuels. Okay? So let's say for example we took your crude oil and from that we are basically deriving a kind of a synthetic polymer. So first we derive what we called as monomer. Monomer can be your ethylene, propylene, etc. Then we basically link them, right, through various chemical oxidation exercises. We basically link them to create a polymer like polyethylene, polypropylene, etc. Now these polymers like polyethylene and polypropylene, they kind of consist of very strong carbon to carbon bond, which is very difficult to break, first and foremost through the natural process. Second, also try to understand this, that the fungi, bacteria, right, etc., they evolved over a million of years to actually kind of decompose organic matter. So they actually find themselves kind of incapable to degrade or to kind of decompose these plastic materials. So basically this plastic waste which is being generated, it is very difficult for it to be recycled or decomposed through the natural process. And thus, while we keep on generating plastic significantly, and if we do not recycle it significantly, then don't you think it is actually going to create a kind of a huge mountains of waste? Okay, which you guys can also see in the Gazipur landfills. A live example is there. So thus, plastic, which is a non-biodegradable synthetic component made up of synthetic polymer, right? It do not degrade or decompose through the natural process and thus contains a long degradation time. During this long degradation time, it actually goes through an exercise called as photodegradation, where its components are actually broken down into more smaller components by the UV rays of sun, leading to the creation of microplastics, which, according to the National Institute of Economics, these are plastic fragments which are smaller than 5 mm in the size. ठीक, you're like, ठीक है, it is already being degraded, it is getting smaller and smaller. ठीक है, what impact it can have, ठीक है, on human health or on the health of the ecosystem? Let's try to assess that. What is the impact of these microplastics like polyethylene, polypropylene, nylon, etc.? First and foremost, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was held recently, it actually kind of highlighted the issue of Great Pacific Garbage Patch which has been created. So a large-scale dumping of this non-biodegradable plastic in the region of aquatic ecosystem, in your ponds, lakes, rivers, and more importantly, ocean, has created a kind of an entire garbage patch in the Great Pacific, which is negatively impacting more than 600 aquatic species. Take. Then what starts taking place, that this particular plastic materials, right, they actually start kind of integrating with the aquatic environment. So that basically kind of increases the chemical oxygen demand of the water, of that particular water area, of that particular aquatic region. Don't you think that with this increasing chemical oxygen demand, the oxygen supply which is actually available for the marine ecosystem, that starts declining? So with the rising chemical oxygen demand, the biological oxygen demand of the aquatic species also starts increasing, and thus they basically face a issue of chemical accumulation as well as less oxygen supply, and thus leading to neurological and hormonal imbalances, and more than 1 lakh marine mammals die every year. Then these small fragments are also being inhaled by us as a human, a process called as bioaccumulation, right? So for example, when these plastic materials, they start, getting fragmented into various smaller particles, thanks to the kind of the fragmentation which is being done by the UV rays, the small particles actually, give a component called as bisphenol A. The bisphenol A, which can actually lead to various kind of cardiovascular diseases, infertility, and can even lead to cancer. Also, don't you think it is also significantly impacting the biodiversity as well, with the reduced dissolved oxygen, the impact of the soil fertility, right? So for example, the plastic which is kind of, scattered across the region, don't you think it actually kinds of lead to the less photosynthesis, and that alter the habitat structure as well? ठीक? So this growing menace of plastic waste is going to have a significant impact on the marine ecosystem, on the overall ecological biodiversity, on the soil fertility, on the level of photosynthesis, as well as on the human health as well. The moment we have understood this, the second question which shall come in your mind is that what shall be the magnitude of this plastic waste? And for that purpose, we will refer to a report which was also published in your Hindu called as Global Plastic Outlook 2025 by OECD, according to which the plastic production has doubled between the year of 2000 to 2019. And in the year of 2024 itself, we ended up producing globally 460 million tons of plastic production. Keep this in mind. Only 9% of the waste generated was recycled, and thus 353 million tons of plastic was actually discarded as waste. 40% of this plastic waste comes from the sector of packaging. Keep this in mind, it will help you in the to understand the kind of the plastic waste management tools which has been launched by India. Take 12% by the consumer goods and 11% by the textile. Take how much global plastic is being recycled? Only 9%, and 19% is just being incinerated, and thus will release what? Various kind of carbon dioxide gases, because it is being derived from what? Fossil fuel. And thus this plastic waste actually accounts for 3.4% of the greenhouse gas emission. 50% of this plastic waste actually find its way into the landfills, and 22% waste entirely evades any kind of waste management. Take. Now don't you think that with the increasing uses of various kind of cheap products which we are having, take, the more consumption will increase, the more plastic generation will also increase. Correct? 220 million tons of plastic waste will be created in 2024, EA Earth Action, out of which just 12 countries are responsible for 60% of the world's mismanaged plastic waste. And the top 5 includes China at number 1, USA at 2nd, and India is the 3rd largest plastic waste generator. Take. So by the year of 2060, the plastic waste generation is actually going to triple, reaching to 1.2 billion tons. And thus, even currently, 50% of the world population is right now living in the areas where plastic waste has actually exceeded the managing capacities of the various kind of authorities. Our country in the year of 2025 generated approximately 1.5 lakh tons of garbage daily, but keep this in mind that by the year of 2060, as per the projection by OECD, we are going to generate 160 million tons of plastic waste, out of which 70 million ton is going to leak to aquatic environment. 128 million ton is going to be entirely plastic waste. So if we are not going to kind of significantly increase exponentially our plastic waste recycling facilities, it is going to be a huge danger for our ecosystem, for our biodiversity, and as well as for our human health. Now link it with the earlier topic. Don't you think with the influx of tourists, with creation of such great infrastructure, such plastic waste will also start proliferating in the region of Great Nicobar? That can also be an environmental concern, and that's how you can interlink the topics also. With the increasing use of laptops, various kind of mobiles, tablets, and various kind of electronic devices in which a large component actually comes from plastic, the e-waste generation has also become one of the rising issue, where India is already one of the top 5 e-waste producers in the world, where Maharashtra itself contributes to 2 million tons of e-waste generated in India, where only 22% of this entire electronic waste chain is actually being recycled. Take. So issue is of severe concern. There is a rising magnanimous amount of plastic waste generation. Have our government caught sleeping on this issue? Aisa nahi hai. Our government has taken some steps. First and foremost was Plastic Waste Management Rules of 2021, where our government said that see, there are certain items of plastic which are used only for single time. Like for example, plastic carry bags which are less than 75 micron in thickness, right? Earbuds with plastic stick for balloons, or your let's say various ice cream stick, or polystyrene thermocol for decoration, wrapping or packing films around sweet boxes. So such single-use plastic items, 19 categories of such were banned by the government of India. Then government actually gave a very specific directive to the petrochemical industries, said that do not supply raw materials to such plastic manufacturers who are creating this product. The same directive was also given very recently in the context of LPG shortage. Take it, because from where we derive LPG also from fossil fuels only. Take it. Then the State Pollution Control Board and Pollution Coordination Committee in the districts were giving a very specific directive that they shall revoke the consent of operation entirely if any such manufacturer is still manufacturing these categories of single-use plastic. And now let's say for example, if you are making any product and you want a certification for biodegradable plastic, then you are required to submit your documents directly to the Central Pollution Control Board, and only then you will get the manufacturing permit. Also, under the Namaste scheme, National Action for Mechanized Sanitation Ecosystem, the government also integrated the waste pickers who actually collect these plastic waste into the formal waste collection system for better collection, at least from the spot of generation. Further steps were taken by the government. For example, government under the Environment Protection Act of 1986 specifically applies a environment damage compensation on the factories, where it says that if you are generating, let's say for example, such significant amount of plastic waste which is going to have a detrimental impact on the biological ecosystem, then you are required to pay a EDC or environment damage compensation, which will be eventually utilized to kind of further create various kind of recycling units. Then the producers and the manufacturers also have a extended producer responsibility, under the plastic waste management rule of 2024, a question which was also asked in your prelims examination. Then the Food Safety and Standard Authority of India has also launched a micro and nano plastic removal project, where it has given a specific directive to various food processing and producing companies that in whatever container you are actually storing the food, make sure that it does not, or at least does not, contain a significant amount of plastic. The Advertising Standard Council of India has said that if there is any company who is manufacturing any product and you are saying this product is entirely eco-friendly, right, or it contains 0% plastic, then you need to provide substantial evidence for that to actually kind of prevent the kind of greenwashing which takes place. Also, under the Consumer Protection Act of 2019, it prohibits any kind of deceptive claims and outline the penalties. Even in the research criteria, the Indian Institute of Science researchers, they design novel hydrogel, which you guys can see here, to remove the microplastics from water. However, there are certain challenges which still persist. So the first and foremost was to actually taking the cognizance of this increasing issue of plastic waste generation. The United Nations Environment Assembly, it basically passed a resolution in the year of 2022 called as End Plastic Pollution. And thus the idea was that all 193 member countries, they will sit and negotiate that how we can phase out, eliminate the plastic which is being generated. Okay? Now remember that for various kind of storage activities, for the manufacturing of various kind of products, plastic actually act as a kind of a cheap raw material. So don't you think that many of the developing nations, they will be very apprehensive of this idea of phase out plastics? Okay? So thus they also kind of acted as a kind of an impediment when it came to the plastic treaty negotiations of 2024, right? So while there was a kind of a discussion which was taking place for international legally binding instrument to end the plastic pollution, there was a kind of an international negotiation committee which was created by the United Nations Environment Program, and the idea was to actually kind of devise a plan to phase out plastic. However, various developing nations like for example South Africa, Russia, China, Iran, they said that no, we cannot kind of vehemently impose this directive of phase out plastic. What will happen to the global south? Don't you think you are actually shifting the burden, right, of kind of actually procuring some very expensive raw material to kind of entirely replace the plastic, right? And that will act as a kind of an impediment in the growth trajectory of this developing nation. है ना? तो ये तो हमसे नहीं हो पाएगा. So instead of phase out, let's first and foremost tone it down to phase down plastic production. And also remember that even the countries whose majority of the economy actually lies upon the export of petroleum products, the petroleum products or fossil fuels which are eventually utilized to create these plastic polymers, don't you think they will also be apprehensive of this phase out plastic idea? Thus, 36% of the lobbyists from the chemical sectors, they also said that this is not at all within the mandate of United Nations Environment Assembly to kind of impose such directive at the first place. Even when our government actually tried to impose such kind of a blanket ban on the single-use plastic, you know that it already backfired. It actually created a kind of an inflationary pressure in the economy. Thus, even our government has toned down. So earlier the targets which was set for the companies to be achieved by the year of 2026 has already been postponed to the year of 28-29. So let's say there are certain very significant industries which are using highly intensive use of plastics. They are basically categorized in the category 1, right, the rigid plastic packaging category. Government is now saying that by the year of 2028, that is 2 years down the line, you just recycle 30% of the material. And then eventually we will raise it to 60%. For category 2, which uses basically flexible kind of plastics, 10% shall be recycled by 2026 and eventually 20% by 2028. For category 3, where they use multi-layered plastics, they can have a 5% recycled material by the year of 26, and 2 years down the line they can actually significantly increase the recycled component to almost only 10%. So kind of a dilution of the targets has taken place by the government of India. So what can be done in the long run? First and foremost is inclusion of the repairability factor in design and procurement policy, to actually kind of social engineer the people, right? Through using, let's say, for example, Prakriti mascot, to make them aware, specifically the children who are in the school and going to become the demographic dividend of the future, to actually start understanding about the harmful impact of plastic, and thus kind of sensitize them to use more greener products, to actually use the biotechnology, like for example, the bacteria which can actually act as plastic eating bacteria, to further create public-private partnership projects for increased fund allocation to municipalities and use of CSR funds. We can also create on-site composting and waste-to-wealth plants also. And then we can also draw models from the global best practices, like for example, China's Hangzhou, which leads global shift towards zero waste cities, or for example, Australia, which has take place another shape towards its throwaway society, where a range of single-use plastics, straws, cutlery, microbeads has been entirely banned. So we can take all of these pragmatic steps. Take it. Just try to use them as a way forward in this question, and we move forward to the next news, where the Donald Trump taking another initiative following the kind of the market protectionism policy on which he has embarked upon, has actually announced 100% tariff on the patented pharma products from India. So what is the context of the news? The USA on Thursday announced a 100% tariff on import of patented pharmaceuticals and associated ingredients starting from July 31, on the grounds that USA is heavily reliant on imports, which actually ends up threatening to limit access to life-saving medications in the event of a global supply chain disruption. Keep this in mind that earlier the pharmaceutical products which we were exporting to USA were exempted from 50% tariffs which were actually imposed by the USA on Indian product. So the question which shall be coming in your mind is that how significantly it is going to impact our pharmaceutical industry. To understand that, just look at the Indian pharma's top export destination, where the share of total pharma exports to a specific country, that is 34% of our pharma exports, actually goes to USA, which amounts to almost a trade of $10 billion. Then 3% of it goes to UK, 2.5 to Brazil, 2.3 to France, and 2.2 to South Africa. Just look at the kind of huge gap which exists with the exports which we do with USA, and then the second ranked country, which is actually UK. So USA is India's largest market for pharmaceutical exports, and now they are actually trying to curb down this huge reliance on India, citing the supply chain disruption which has taken place thanks to the kind of the war which is taking place in the West Asia, for which they themselves are primarily responsible. But another interpretation by today's article is that it might be a pressure tool to actually push Indian drug makers to cut down the prices of our pharmaceutical products. As per the Global Trade Research Institute, 90% of our India's exports are generic in the nature, and they do not are being made under a very specific patent or something, and thus they will remain unaffected. So that can be a good sight of for us as well. More importantly, maybe this particular initiative by the USA is that if you want to keep this 10 billion profitable trade alive, then try to invest in USA's local supply chain and try to create these various kind of pharmaceutical products within USA. So when we come to the pharmaceutical industry, let's first try to have a kind of an overall look from the perspective of the prelims examination. Keep this in mind that the industry's advancements in biologics, specialty generics, and AI-driven technologies are actually redefining the healthcare solutions worldwide. That was also very easily reflected in the Vaccine Maitri initiative, which was launched by our country, where we ended up providing COVID vaccine to more than 90 countries. Thus, currently, India's pharmaceutical industry is third largest in the world in the terms of volume and 11th largest in the world in the terms of value, where in our country there exist more than 3,000 pharma companies and more than 10,000 drug manufacturing facilities. Keep this in mind that when it comes to the supply of generic drugs, our country accounts for more than 1/5 of the global supply, where we are producing more than 60% of the global demand for vaccine, sell pharmaceuticals to more than 200 countries, and also contains highest number of US FDA approved plants outside USA. In 2025, we amounted to an export of more than $30 billion, and now look at this data from USA. So almost 1/3 of our total pharmaceutical export goes to one country, and that is USA. That's why this ban seems more important, or this imposition of tariff becomes more important. The projection is that our pharmaceutical industry itself is going to grow up to $130 billion export by the year of 2030. And when we are actually aspiring to become a $30 trillion economy, $1 trillion will actually come from pharmaceutical industry by the year of 2047. Just look at the exponential market expansion which has taken place, the compounded annual growth rate year after year in the recent years. And our India's drug and pharmaceutical export, just look how it increased almost by 9% between 23 to 24. And to actually facilitate that, our government has also taken some very pragmatic steps. For example, it has actually brought the production of complex generics and high value added medicine under the production linked incentive scheme as well. Then let's say, for example, there is a company who wants to invest in any pharmaceutical industry in our country. There is 100% foreign direct investment which is allowed under the automatic route itself. Then our government is also creating bulk drug parks. The idea is to actually create or produce active pharmaceutical ingredients indigenously. Because, fun fact, so we are exporting, right? Let's say, for example, to USA, take it up to, let's say, $10 billion. We are producing, let's say, for example, almost world's 20% of the global supply, correct? 60% of the global demand for vaccine. But for more than 2/3 of our active pharmaceutical ingredient need, which is basically a kind of the chemical formula which is required to create the drug, for more than 2/3 of that, we are actually reliant on China and on import. So our government is saying that let's start manufacturing these active pharmaceutical ingredients indigenously also. And for that purpose, our government is creating bulk drug parks for specialized industrial zones. Then the National Institute of Pharmaceutical Research is actually, kind of conducting advanced research in biopharma and repurposed drug. The Central Drug Standard Control Authority has got a non-objection certificate for exports from zonal office. And as per the Section 83 of Patent Act, it actually specifically aims to promote innovations in the region of pharmaceutical industry, for which purpose the government has launched Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Promotion and Development Scheme for the preparation of study reports on the topics of importance for Indian pharma, to actually create a database of pharmaceutical and medical device sector, and also to create a non-financial logo support for pharma and medical devices events. So remember all of these initiatives for the perspective of the prelims examination as well, and they will act as a kind of a validation for your mains answer when you are writing for pharmaceutical industry. We move forward to the next news, where we will quickly try to understand the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and the Resolvency procedure which exist in our country. First and foremost, what is the context of the news? The Parliament on Wednesday has passed a recent bill, so more probability of being asked in prelims, and that is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Bill 2026. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which was enacted for the first time in 2016 to create a time-bound mechanism to deal with the companies that actually end up defaulting on their loans by reviving them through a resolution or liquidation process if resolution is not possible. The amendment currently seeks to speed up the resolution process and introduces provisions for an out-of-court mechanism as well, which we'll try to understand, and group insolvency and cross-border insolvency as well. Okay? So first and foremost, let's try to understand what is the difference between insolvency and bankruptcy. So let's say, for example, I am a kind of a airline company, okay? And we can just, kind of create a name for us. The name can be Queenfisher, okay? So I'm an airline company, that is Queenfisher, and to actually kind of procure, let's say, for example, various kind of aeroplanes, air jets, staff, etc., I go to a bank, okay? That bank can be, let's say, for example, the non-state Bank of India, and I take, let's say, for example, hypothetically a loan of 9,000 crore rupees, okay? But as the luck would have it, the airline do not function or the airline end up becoming non-profitable entity for me. Thus, the loan which I have taken from the non-state Bank of India, I am unable to pay the interest amount or to actually repay the kind of the total money which I have borrowed. If I am unable to pay that for 90 days, then I will be declared as an insolvent company. Queen Fisher has become insolvent. So that is inability to pay the interest or the principal amount for a period of 90 days. Then let's say, for example, the non-state Bank of India goes to the Supreme Court and files a case against Queen Fisher. And the court declares that yes, indeed, this person does not have any financial capability to actually repay the loans which they have taken from you. And thus, I have been declared now bankrupt, the incapability of paying dues, and thus, now, if this non-state Bank of India wants, it can actually go and appeal. Okay? Where? To the National Company Law Tribunal, and thus a kind of a corporate insolvency resolution process will kick in. Okay? Let's first try to understand the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016, which basically establishes a quasi-judiciary body, that is National Company Law Tribunal, to resolve the insolvency among both individual and companies. So the case can be registered against me also as a owner of the company and as against the company as an entity. The company which has been registered under the Companies Act 2013, and the entire procedure is actually kind of guaranteed or governed by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Now, if this non-state Bank of India is approaching the NCLT, it can only do so if the minimum amount of default is 1 crore rupees. Okay? Now let's try to understand the procedure. So first and foremost, this non-state Bank of India, let's call it NSBI. NSBI will basically file an application to National Company Law Tribunal. Okay? Now remember, this NSBI which has given the loan to me of 9,000 crore rupees, so that will be called as a financial creditor. Then the question shall come in your mind, who is the operational creditor? So let's say, for example, when I had created the company, I also hired several staff, right? I hired the pilots, the air hostess, the ground staff, etc. But when from the 90 days or from 3 months, more than 3 months, when I did not had any money, right? I was not earning any money, then don't you think I was unable to pay them their salaries also, their dues also? So in this case, they have become a kind of an operational creditor. Even they can go to NCLT, even NSBI can go to NCLT. So application can be filed by both of them. In fact, even I can also go to NCLT and tell them that I am not having any money right now. Please start a resolution process or liquidation process. The NCLT earlier had to decide within 14 days and could reject also that no, we are not going to take this case. You go to High Court or somewhere. Take it. Section 16 provides for the appointment of the interim resolution professionals called as IRP. So if NCLT accepts, then they will basically kind of appoint a interim resolution professionals or IRP who are going to prepare the resolution plan. Okay? That okay, we can, let's say liquidate this 20% of your assets. From that, let's say this much money will come. We will invest this much money into, let's say, for example, flying some cheap cost airlines. From that, whatever the money will get, will start, let's say, first and foremost, giving the salary to the operational creditors. Over a period of time, if the profit is being generated, we'll give the money to the financial creditor also. However, it stands entirely opposite. Remember, there is a mechanism called as waterfall mechanism. In waterfall mechanism, whenever a case goes to NCLT and a kind of an insolvency resolution process is initiated, the priority, right, is always given to the financial creditor over the operational creditor. Okay? So now, when such resolution plan has been created by the interim resolution professionals or IRP, then that will be presented to the committee of creditors, which will include the financial creditor also and operational creditors also. If 66% of them agree, take care that okay, we are okay with this resolution plan, then everything is fine. But if 66% of them do not agree, then we will go towards liquidation of assets कि जितना हमारे पास है उसको sell कर देते हैं and whatever we get from that we will just distribute. ठीक? To actually for the completion of this entire resolution or liquidation process, the timeline which was earlier set was 180 plus 90 days and maximum extension was allowed for 330 days. So within a span of an year, this entire case shall be done and dusted. However, let's try to look at the performance as per the data which has been provided to us by the PRS Legislative Research, where the resolution plan which was ultimately approved by the committee of creditor was only 19%. In 43% cases, the liquidation took place. Okay. Ultimately, the assets were required to be sold off. Nobody agreed upon the resolution plan. Even today, 1905 out of 8492 cases are pending for the resolution processes to be approved. Right. Then the CRPs that resulted in the resolution plan, they actually took average of how many days? 602 days. What was the maximum target which was decided was 330, almost double. The yielded recoveries from liquidation also admitted only to 33%, right? So let's say for example, I gave the loan of 9,000 crore and I'm only being able to recover 3,000 crore. 6,000 crore is the loss which is being made by most of the entities. So our government basically, brought some new amendments in the new bills, where it said that now the NCLT do not have that kind of authority where it can reject the case entirely. If the default is proven that yes, indeed, this particular person has defaulted, and that is proven, let's say, by the financial creditor or the operational creditor, then NCLT shall accept the application. Take it, first thing. Second, it has introduced the creditor initiated insolvency resolution process. Okay. So even the creditor can initiate now, right, such insolvency resolution process where it can ask that, okay, I do not want to go to the court. So let's say the officials of NSBI came to my house and I also sit with them and we both decide that under the supervision of NCLT, we are not going to fight a case. Let's first try for an out of court initiation mechanism. Then if there are certain cases which are of the very same nature, or if it involves, let's say, kind of trans-country business involvements also. So there is a group insolvency and cross-border insolvency process. 3 months timeline has been set. So let's say, for example, NCLT passed a judgment. But as, let's say, for example, as a person, right, who has defaulted, I'm not agreeing to that. And then I'm appealing to the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal. So even now that tribunal has a kind of a 3-month deadline to reduce the appellate delays. And the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India shall actually conduct some very important standards for the meeting of the Committee of Creditors or the creation of it. So these are some very important provisions of the new bill. Keep this in mind for your prelims examination and we move forward to the next news, where we will try to understand about the India's newly inducted third nuclear submarine, which is INS Aridaman. So India has inducted its third nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, that is INS Aridaman, which significantly strengthen our sea-based nuclear deterrence capabilities. So with INS Aridaman's induction, India will now have 3 operational ballistic missile submarines at sea for the first time. Take the indigenous SSB, that is Ship Submersible Ballistic Nuclear, is designed to carry more long-range nuclear-tipped missiles than INS Arihant and INS Arighat, the other 2 nuclearly powered submarines which we have in our country. A small, kind of a question which can be framed by UPSC, where it can actually end up asking you the difference which prevails between the ballistic and the cruise missile. So for example, these nuclear-powered submarine basically consist of ballistic missiles. So let's try to understand the difference between ballistic and your cruise missile. Ballistic missiles basically, they follow a kind of a parabolic or a ballistic trajectory. On the other hand, the cruise missile basically flies on a straight, low altitude. So ballistic missile basically use the rocket propulsion, the nuclear's third law, while cruise missiles use the air-breathing engines, ramjet engines, which require the atmospheric oxygen. The ballistic missiles are powered only in the initial boost phase and they actually contain a very high speed up to the Mach 5. So these ballistic missiles, they basically travel outside the atmosphere following a trajectory in the mid-course, and that's why they are less maneuverable and follows a kind of a predefined trajectory. In comparison to that, the cruise missile, it continuously powered through the flight jet, ramjet engines. Their speed is less a bit, subsonic, supersonic in comparison to the ballistic missile. But they flies within the atmosphere at a very low altitude. So remember that they are terrain hugging. They are cruising over the terrain. And thus they are highly maneuverable and can change the path mid-flight. Take. Now when we talk about the INS Aridaman, it very significantly strengthened the India's nuclear triad, where now India has capability to fire nuclear missiles from air, from land and from sea, right? For example, the aircraft carriers which can, kind of carry nuclear missiles, Rafale, Su-30, Mirage. Then the countries other than India which have such nuclear triad capability are US, Russia, France and China, and India is the only fifth country in the world. However, we follow a policy called as no first use policy, where we are going to use our nuclear power only in the case of deterrence and retaliation. So yes, we will not attack you first, but we will also make sure that you can never attack us for the second time. That is our simple doctrine. Take it. Project 75 with Germany we have launched to actually create advanced conventional submarines, and currently we have such 16 conventional submarines in the service. This is your explained article which came in the news today. INS Arihant, which was commissioned in 2016, which has a missile capability to fire up to 700 kilometer range. Take it. Then comes your INS Arihant, inducted in the year of 2024. Similar in the terms of power, launch tubes and displacement, but much more technologically advanced than the Arihant. Believed to support K4 missiles with a range of 3,500 kilometers, but with the commission of INS Aridaman, we have basically increased the displacement up to 7,000 tons, as well as it has a kind of a K4 missiles which has a range of 3,500 kilometers. Take it. Keep these facts in your mind. Very clearly remember INS Aridaman, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll quickly try to understand the concept of El Nino and how it significantly impacts our economy. So what does the article tells today? All of these are explained articles, very important. The article says that the typically Indian policymakers, right, the Reserve Bank of India, they hope to achieve an inflation rate of 4%. That is, general price level goes up by 4% from one year to the next. Take. This level has been chosen because it is considered as an ideal. So 4% inflation is high enough to actually kind of incentivize the producers to produce more, to earn more. And it is actually low enough to not hit the consumer demand, to not significantly deter the propensity to consume of the people. However, since late 2019, thanks to the series of supply shocks which we are facing, first the pandemic, then the Russia's war in Ukraine, then the kind of, not to mention the unseasonal rainfalls, and now the recent disturbances which has taken place in the West Asia, the India's inflation rate has often stayed above the RBI's target of 4% and often outside its comfort zone. And this zone, the comfort zone, actually ranges between plus minus to 4%. कहाँ से आ रहा है ये रेट, क्यों डिसाइड हुआ? That comes from Finance Act 2016, which basically amended the RBI Act of 1934 and created inflation targeting as a very primary objective of the monetary policy which has to be followed by the Reserve Bank of India. Setting up a target range of 4% consumer price index, inflation of plus minus 2% as a kind of a tolerance band. Take. Idea is that the RBI shall maintain such target range validity till 31st of March 2026, after which it was going to be revised. So maybe it will be revised in a very nearby date. There also exists an accountability clause. So RBI has, this monetary policy committee has to maintain this inflation between the range of 2 to 6%. Take it? 4% is idle, 2% plus minus is the tolerance band. But if it fails to keep the inflation within this band of 2 to 6% for 3 consecutive quarters or 9 months, then it has to report to the government about the reasons and the remedial actions. Take. Now, who is the authoritative body? That is the Monetary Policy Committee, which consists of 6 members, the RBI governor, the deputy governor and 1 RBI official, and 3 members who are nominated by the government. Now let's try to understand that what is this El Nino and how it impacts this inflation targeting by the RBI. So in normal condition, look at this map. Take it. You guys might have heard about the easterlies which takes place. So they blow from the east to west direction across the equator, and thus they also facilitate the sailing of the ships, and that's why they are called as trade winds. So in normal conditions, these easterlies, they blow from east to west direction, and thus from the
west coast of South America towards your Southeast Asia and then ultimately towards the east coast of Africa. So they reach till here, okay? And by the time they reach, the sun has moved to the Tropic of Cancer, and because of this there is a huge intertropical convergence zone which has been created here, okay? Very high temperature. So it's very obvious that the air pressure has become very low. So the air pressure in this region is much lower in comparison to the air pressure in this region at the equator at that point of a time, okay? Because sun is just providing all the heat at this ITCZ only, and thus the seasonal reversal of wind take place from the east coast of Africa and towards India, ठीक है? यही है आपका simple structure. Easterlies which actually ends up accumulating warm water in the western Pacific Ocean, and because the warm water has gone into this direction, so the cold water basically comes to the coast of west coast of South America, and that is the Peru coast, ठीक? But let's say if a huge amount of global warming is taking place in this region and the temperature starts rising up, right? So basically the air follows a simple principle. It blows from high pressure to low pressure. But now the temperature in this region itself has increased. Don't you think the easterlies will not find the same incentive to move in this direction, to move from here to here? And thus the weakening of trade wind has taken place. Or rivers and warm water starts moving eastward now instead of westward how it was moving. This is called as weakening of the normal existing water circulation, and this accumulation of hot water now on the west coast of South America, this thing is called as Kelvin waves. The warm water accumulates in the central and eastern Pacific. अब यहीं पे low pressure हो गया. So why the air will move in this direction from high pressure to low pressure? Why it will significantly reach to the east coast of Africa? And if the air is not reaching here only, don't you think the rising air shifts and the convection shifts eastward? So the trade wind cycle entirely ends up weakening, thus less seasonal reversal wind possible from this masculine high. Masculine high is the place in the region of Africa from where the seasonal reversal takes place to the low pressure area of ITCZ, which has been formed at the just on the southward of Himalayas. Clear? So basically, don't you think that the entire monsoon cycle is going to be disrupted? Below normal rainfall will take place. Below normal rainfall will significantly impact the kharif crops like for example rice, pulses and oilseed, है ना? तो अब in this case में farmer क्या कर सकते हैं? कुछ नहीं कर सकते. You can only kind of rely on पूजा, ठीक है? और कोई option नहीं है आपके पास. And thus a huge supply shortage of food grain will take place. Rise in food inflation. Rise in food inflation, reduced farmer income also, less propensity to consume, overall impact what? The industrial output leading to less GDP growth. And thus the government will have to intervene following the Article 38, which establishes ourselves as a welfare state, to provide various kind of finances, relief packages, to kind of procure the crop at minimum support price, to actually kind of provide for the crop losses which has taken place under Fasal Bima Yojana, to provide various kind of food subsidies. And thus the El Nino extreme can significantly increase the inflation rate. Okay? So we have to prepare for this kind of uncertainties also when we are going to work for the government and administration. So keep this thing in your mind and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we are going to learn about a legendary personality today. And the name of that person is Biju Patnaik. First and foremost, why Biju Patnaik is in the news? Because very recently the BJP MP had to apologize for his remark about the former Odisha Chief Minister Biju Patnaik, where he basically said that Patnaik was a link between the US's Central Intelligence Agency CIA and the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, sparking outrage among the Odisha BJP leaders too. He further alleged that Patnaik actually helped the CIA operate U-2 reconnaissance aircraft from the Charbatia Air Base in Odisha, which actually hosted an American military presence in India in the 1960s. He was not factually incorrect. We'll try to assess that. First and foremost, the first time when you actually get introduced to Biju Patnaik in modern Indian history is during the Quit India movement. So when on 8th of August 1942, the Quit India movement was launched, right, through the Gwalior Tank Resolution. In the early morning hours of 9th of August, the entire senior leadership of Congress was arrested by the Britishers. Okay? Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Gandhi, everyone. Okay? And thus the Congress or the movement itself was rendered kind of leaderless. In the light of that, there were several people who actually kind of contributed to our country's independence struggle and basically made it kind of a people's movement. For example, Jayaprakash Narayan, who escaped from the Hazaribagh Central Jail, moved into the forest of Chota Nagpur and started a kind of a underground guerrilla group called as Azad Dasta, where the people were being trained as far as in the region of Nepal. Or your Ram Manohar Lohia and Usha Mehta, who started secret radio broadcast. Aruna Asaf Ali, who hoisted the Indian national flag at the Gowalia Tank Maidan. R.P. Goenka, who basically channeled the funds to the groups led by Jayaprakash Narayan, Patwardhan, Ram Manohar Lohia, etc. And Biju Patnaik, a trained aircraft pilot at that point of a time, used his civil aviation techniques to aid the underground movement and conducted daring missions to transport political activists, secret documents, evade British detection at that point of a time. The same Biju Patnaik, who also supplied various kind of supplies and logistic support to the Soviet forces working for the British government during the Battle of Stalingrad 1943. And for that purpose, he also got the Order of Lenin, which is considered to be the highest civil decoration of the Soviet Union. Then in the year of 1947, our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was actually trying to conduct the first Inter-Asia Conference of 1947, which was going to be a kind of a hallmark against the colonization which was prevailing in the world. And for that purpose, he also wanted the Prime Minister, right, the declared Prime Minister of the people at that point of a time of Indonesia, PM Suharto, to actually participate in that. However, the Dutch government was not, ensuring that actually Suharto does not leave the Indonesia. And thus it was Biju Patnaik who, on the call of Jawaharlal Nehru, actually went and secured the participation of Indonesia's Prime Minister through military aircraft. And that's why Biju Patnaik has also got the Indonesia's Bhumi Putra or Son of Soil award. In the year of 1961, at the age of 45 years, he ended up becoming the Chief Minister of Odisha, where during the year of 1962-63, when we were fighting with China, he actually sought the collaboration from CIA and John F. Kennedy. And that's why the CIA was actually allowed to use this Charbatia air base in Odisha, which actually indeed hosted an American military presence in the 1960s to actually kind of help us against China. In the year of 1969, he comes up with a clash with Indira Gandhi and ends up setting another party, that is Utkal Congress. Take it. So that's it for today, and with this we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.